Well, first of all, it's a pleasure for me to be here. Thanks for inviting me. And I believe that US current attacks on Venezuela are the perfect interpretation of the hybrid war strategy that the US has implemented for decades, meaning that we can't understand this display as merely an act of psychological warfare, as you say, or a mere psyop, because even though the strongest component of these attacks is the intention to provoke fear mongering among the Venezuelan people, psychological operations are always simply the buildup to the development of military action. And that does not necessarily mean an intention to invade or engage in war, but rather the escalation of conflict to corner the Venezuelan government to the terrain of a weaker force correlation so as to negotiate in the terms best suited for US better interests, which are, of course, linked to their need of Venezuelan oil. Merely 2 weeks ago, Chevron tankers filled to the rim with Venezuelan oil were shipped still to the United States, carrying so much as 900,000 barrels per day of Venezuelan oil to the United States, which means that the only country that's cornered right now is precisely the United States. Except, as we know already, they will always try to bend any sort of international law or potential commercial agreement to represent the lowest cost for them, for the United States. And meanwhile, now they have to buy Venezuelan crude with money. What they're aiming for is to twist the arm of the Bolivarian government to reach full submission and free access to the entire Venezuelan oil reserves, which we have to remember are the highest in the entire planet. I think that this, in the same way that we are very keen on talking about how the left globally can be divided and can be confronted with each other, we also have to take into account that the right, and particularly the Republican Trump's cabinet, is also divided. And we have the Marco Rubio line, we have the hawkish imperialist line, and on the other hand, we have the more diplomatic line of people like Richard Grenell, which used to be the special envoy of the American government to matters regarding Venezuela. And he is precisely the guy that negotiated with Maduro to reopen the Chevron shipments of oil that we were just talking about. And yet these two branches are confronted. On the one hand, there's the side that wants to continue buying Venezuelan crude through Chevron. And we have the other line, the hawkish Marco Rubio line, which wants to have full access to this oil, not by buying, but by just controlling the entire country, which is the very same strategy that they have followed not only in Latin America, but in the entirety of the global South, including the Middle East and Africa and Latin America in regards to mineral extraction, to oil. So I think that if we were to look at it very precisely, we are talking about this confrontation at the internal level in Trump's government, and that is to only signify that their actions can be weakened by that, because there will always be two sides of the very same operation, and they will be boycotting each other constantly throughout this entire display. Yeah, I think that is very much part of the same psychological warfare strategy of portraying within the very same US government figures that could represent the good cop and the bad cop, which is to say that in the same imperialist force, there's a side that pushes and a side that negotiates. When that is absolutely false, because they all, maybe they differ on the way to achieve these goals, but they all have the same one goal. And they have had that for the entirety of the US empire's existence, which is that it doesn't matter if the person who is in the White House, it comes from the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, they will always have these intentions towards the global South and especially our resources. But I believe that the Venezuelan government has also been kind of pushing and pulling with this narrative, especially because there's still oil shipments being made to the United States, which is, suffice to say, that this is potentially a psychological warfare strategy to corner Venezuela into negotiating with the United States in a term that is more akin to the interests, to the economic and geopolitical interests of the United States. And I believe that we have to take very much into consideration that even though Marco Rubio is being the personification of this hawkish side of the American army, he can also be sort of a chameleon-like figure, because in this very same week that this attack was performed on Venezuela, this alleged drug boat, at the very same time he was here in Mexico City negotiating and speaking to the Mexican president in a radically different tone, which is to say that these figures will always play different roles depending on what their direct correlation of forces are with the specific Latin American region and country that they're dealing with. So it is a farce to think that Marco Rubio is the only hawk in the American army and in the American government, because they all will try to push their interests in whatever way they're able to. Of course, as far as the assassination of these 11 people allegedly riding a drug boat in the Caribbean Ocean, leaving Venezuela, we're talking about an operation intentionally riddled with ambiguity. I mean, the first to communicate this assault was the very president of the United States in a social media post where he bragged about this multiple homicide being executed on his command, sharing a video footage of the event, which is where the very questions begin to emerge. I mean, we're talking about a 30-second video in the blurriest of definitions with no data on the specific location, date, or time of the execution, which is where theories have emerged, indicating the potential falsehood of the footage, implying that it was forged using artificial intelligence, something which I personally would strongly disagree with. However, we still don't know if we would be talking about an assassination being carried out in the Caribbean Ocean on September 2nd, as Trump's administration alleges, or, as it has also been speculated, that this was an assassination carried out in a radically different location with maybe radically different purposes, and perhaps long before this psychological warfare montage even began. But regardless of which of the last two options is the reality, we're still talking about the multiple homicide of 11 people by the US military in complete violation of international law, human rights, and the basic right to a fair trial, presumption of innocence, and, if proven with hard evidence of their culpability, then the right to serve legal jail time accordingly, all of which were violated criminally by the United States government, which should be sufficient cause for global outrage in the eve of international law already being suffocated underground by the very same forces who are conducting what the UN and Geneva Convention classifies as genocide on the Palestinian people. So regardless of whereby this footage is real and actually targeted Venezuelan civilians, or if it was an attack coordinated somewhere else and merely used as a psyop technique to incite fear among Venezuela and Latin America as a whole, what we're seeing is the direct effect of the genocide in Palestine and the strategy that they have developed there being all of a sudden covered throughout the entire world and in the very specific regions to which the United States has a specific interest on. I think that we would be seeing a radically different scenario if it hadn't been for the fact that both the Chinese government and the Russian government have pledged their support for the Venezuelan government, and particularly in the said case that Venezuela would be military targeted. And in that sense, I believe that Venezuela is a country, as so many others in our global south, that are at this point veterans in fighting and defending themselves from American attacks. military, psychological, diplomatic, political attacks, or whichever type. So I believe that the strategy that Maduro has implemented right now in making a national call for civilians to engage in the national militia to protect the nation has had the opposite effect to what Trump might have predicted by showcasing this military display of forces, which is to say that even a very significant part of the Venezuelan opposition in Venezuela has declared themselves in opposition to a potential U.S. military attack on their country. And that has had regional impacts. We have figures like Gustavo Petro, the Colombian president, showcasing his support, and not only that, but his disposition to forge a military alliance between Venezuela and Colombia to protect that part of the region from a potential U.S. attack. We have the Mexican president even pledging her support to Venezuela in defense of their sovereignty. So we are seeing a very strong defense on behalf of the entire Latin American region in opposition to this potential strike. And I believe that as part of Maduro's strategy to combat this, a very important part is specifically when we're talking about psychological warfare is the creation of a counter narrative to combat the US hegemonical narrative. So right now, I think it is particularly relevant to cite, and what Maduro has made a very clear point in citing over and over again is the very United Nations. We have to really take into account this document that the United Nations Drug and Crime Unit has released very little ago that directly disproves the US narrative intending to portray Venezuela as a drug trafficking hotspot, and the certainty that this particular boat intercepted in the Caribbean Ocean was indeed carrying drugs coming from Venezuela to the United States. Now, this UN Drug and Crime Unit has very recently released a document stated that Venezuela has managed to consolidate itself in the last 15 years as a land free of cocaine and marijuana plantations, as well as of cocaine processing, which directly disproves Trump's narrative on Venezuela as the highest drug-producing nation. And not only that, but the very same UN department reported that 87% of cocaine trafficking is affected through the Colombian and Ecuadorian Pacific Ocean, from which the drug then travels all the way to Central America and Mexico, from where it is distributed to the United States. Now let's repeat that. 87% of cocaine trafficking happens in the Pacific Ocean, not the Caribbean, which leads to the obvious question. If the United States is really trying to stop cocaine trafficking, why is their military being displayed in the Caribbean and not in the real cocaine maritime route, which is the Pacific? And even more so, why would a drug boat allegedly carrying cocaine would choose to traffic it through the Caribbean, where US troops are energetically displayed, and not through the typical route in the Pacific? And if we see this operation through the lens of pure common sense and empirical evidence, in order for such a ship to be capable of reaching the United States, which is something like 3,500 kilometers away from the approximate location of where the ship is supposed to have been intercepted, it would have needed at least 12,000 liters of gasoline, which would have had to have been stored in the very boat. Yes, thank you very much.